Hello and welcome to my 6th video in which I am covering 100 great paintings from Western art history. These are my selections of 100 of the greatest paintings ever made from Western art. So to start off, we are with painting number 60 by Oud Nerdrum, Five Singing Women, 2002, 80 by 147 inches, which is a significant size painting. Now, Oud Nerdrum is a contemporary painter who is fascinated and was fascinated with Baroque painting, specifically Caravaggio and Rembrandt. In my mind, much more Rembrandt than Caravaggio. So we have a high degree of modeling in chiaroscuro, which means a strong degree of light and dark, modeling the figures, which we can see here, especially in their legs, in the wrappings around the figures' legs, their shadows. And he's also totally into the layering of thick, rich, luscious oil paint like Rembrandt. You know, there's that saying of Rembrandt gold, of how he layers the paint so thick and beautiful. And Oud Nerdrum is very well known for saying he doesn't use a brush often in his paintings. He uses a palette knife or his fingers or a rag or papers to rub paint with, or sticks. Anything to make the paint sort of more immediate and build up and layer and create those complex, subtle, earthy colors. Just gorgeous color. Now, his imagery is very haunting. And one of the things that Oud Nerdrum does that many artists do is there's this kind of sense of beauty and not beauty, the sacred and the profane. And we can see this in these figures. These are not idealized, gorgeous people, right? They are regular old people. And they're in a position where, as if we listen to the title or we take into consideration the title, they are possibly singing. However, it's just as easy to think that they're dead. Are they really singing, or are they dead? And why are they wrapped in this cloth and this like skins? And what are they doing? And why are they singing if they're singing? And if they're dead, why are they dead? And it's just haunting and tragic, but beautiful at the same time, and the way he layers paint and the colors he creates. And all of his landscapes are barren and desolate and quiet. His work is so quiet and still and haunting. And is it the past? Is it the future? Is it prehistory? Is it post-apocalyptic? None of it's clear, and as many artists do, there is a sense of enigma, not showing you everything, not explaining everything, but letting the viewer enter into the piece and think about it and digest it and come up with their own meanings. But wow, his work is just beautiful, beautiful work. And as close, I think, as any contemporary painter has ever gotten to sort of recreating kind of the style and the aesthetics of Rembrandt. Number 59, Peter Bruegel the Elder, Le Triomphe de la Mort, The Triumph of Death, from 1562. So I discovered this painting when I was a kid. I think I was around 10 years old. It was actually on the cover of a Pearls Before Swine album, Balaclava, which is a very cool album if anybody wants to check it out, from the early 70s. And God, I was fascinated with this painting. I would just study it and study it and study it. And when I was a kid, you know, I did like art. I kind of made art. I didn't know I was going to be an artist, but I was certainly interested in it. And that's the main reason this painting is in this list. It's not the greatest aesthetic painting. It's not the greatest draftsmanship or drawing skills. It's not the greatest value relationship. It's just an imaginative, wicked nightmare. Like that so much can happen and so much is going on. And every single part of it is painted with that painstaking sort of quasi-realism image to create this nightmare. And to spend hours upon hours upon hours creating this nightmare. Just think about that. And to think up all these little tortures all over the canvas. There's some kind of new torture going on when you really study it. It's just quite, it's like, you know, some kind of hallucination or something. Just really, really, really remarkable. And that's why it's here. Painting number 58 in our 100 great paintings, George Braque, the Portuguese, 1911, 46 inches by 32 inches. This is a smaller piece. Now, this is an example of analytical cubism, one of the most important tenets of what modern art is. Modern art was basically born out of analytical cubism. And so what does that mean? In analytical cubism, the artist is trying to make everything equal everywhere. All things equal. That is very different than the way most people think about painting. So this is a painting of a man playing a guitar. So in a typical painting of a man playing a guitar, the face would be maybe the most important thing. The guitar, maybe the second most important thing, or equal to the face, most important thing. Maybe the clothes and the position of the figure and the hands might be the second, third most important thing. The other objects in the room, the fourth most important thing. And the background, not very important. There was a hierarchy of what was important and what the viewer sort of looked at. Analytical cubism is breaking down all of those relationships. The first relationship, the figure-ground relationship, is destroyed. So we don't even know what is the figure and what is the ground. And when I say ground, I mean the background, the leftover space, the negative space. You don't even know where that stops and starts. The hierarchy of the imagery within the figure, within the story, within the context of the painting is broken down. Color relationships, the guitar is this color and his shirt is that color and his skin is that color. That's all broken down. Every single thing is broken down to its component elements of what aesthetic two-dimensional art is about. And that is shape, surface, line, value. And that's what we're looking at. We're looking at shapes, we're looking at lines, we're looking at surface, the way the painting is created, how the paint is applied to the canvas, and line, which separates parts, one part from another. And value, the light and dark, right? Light and dark is what gives anything its form. Color does not create form. Light and dark creates form. So things are broken down into those elements because that is the reality of what painting is. And that is the goal and the thesis of synthetic cubism. And basically, therefore, that is the goal and the thesis of modern art all the way up to Jackson Pollock. And Jackson Pollock brought that hypothesis to its conclusion, which I will talk about when we get to Jackson Pollock. So that is analytical cubism, and that is George Braque. And George Braque made some of the best analytical cubism paintings ever created. As good or better than Picasso, he just did not get the same kind of recognition that Picasso received. Next, we have 57, Paul Gauguin. I'm not saying that in French. Where did we come from? Why are we here? Where are we going? 1897 to 1898, 55 by 148 inches. And this is sort of Gauguin's magnum opus, if you will, his largest painting, where in some ways he was trying to sum up everything that he had been working towards, working with, thinking about in his work for years. It's a much debated painting. And there's, Gauguin's life, Gauguin's art is provocative. It's complex. There are layers of colonialism, but also authenticity in his work. And how does one thread each part of it? How does one contextualize it? But what I'll say about this painting is it does sum up Gauguin's painterliness, his aesthetic, his use of color, his use of shape. Of course, Gauguin was a post-impressionist and sort of working towards the symbolic tree from post-impressionism. So in modernism, there's these tree branches that kind of emerge from post-impressionism. So, for example, the Van Gogh tree branch goes into expressionism. You could say the Seurat branch of Cézanne branch of post-impressionism, of course, merges into cubism. The Gauguin branch of post-impressionism moves into symbolism, the symbolist movement, and into even, you could make an argument, trace it to surrealism. Not that his work is surrealist, but it sort of began this process of working symbolically. So that images aren't just images, they're images that symbolize something greater. And of course, this work basically is kind of an opus of from birth to death to life. Now, in this case, it goes from right to left. And I think that's a conscious choice to get away from the Western reading of reading things left to right. But here we're reading things right to left, where we have the infant and then middle life and then old age over here on the left. And the various things that symbolize various things for him in his life, in his work, in the image. And again, with that sort of decorative pattern background in which she was very interested in those shapes and serpentine shapes. And so that is Paul Gauguin, one of the major and controversial post-impressionists of the late 19th, early 20th century. Number 56, Georgia O'Keeffe, Deer Skull with Piedernal. Now, I believe Piedernal is the mountain in the back, there. I'm not 100% sure, but I think. So Georgia O'Keeffe, again, one of very few women to have been successful as a visual artist in early modernism, or any time, say, before the 1950. Art was a good old boys club up until the 50s and really up until the 70s. But she made it through. Part of the reason she made it was her connection to Alfred Stieglitz, but certainly not the only reason. So her work is so elegant. And of course, this is at a time when a lot of artists are experimenting with reacting to cubism and abstraction and surrealism. And so their work is far more imaginative or less realistic. But she was still incorporating aspects from that work into her work, just in very subtle ways. And of course, one of the things her work is really effective at is the blending and the use of subtle color and extending color. So like if you look at that blue sky, how many different kinds of blues are actually in that sky? Or if you look at the skull and you see those light tan ivory colors, how many light tan ivory colors there actually are if you really break it down. Even the green grass down below, so many greens just in that little section. So much elegance, complexity of color that appears to be simple, but in fact is not simple. And the other thing Georgia O'Keeffe worked really well with is shape. And both positive and negative shape and how those shapes relate to each other. And so here we see this tree sort of in the middle, but not in the middle. And if you notice, like, everything about this image is sort of symmetrical, but not really symmetrical. So the tree's not quite in the middle, and it's not quite straight, and it has two branches on one side and one branch on the other side, two high branches, one low branch. So that breaks the symmetry. And if you look at the skull, the antlers are slightly different from each other. One's a little lower. One goes off the top a little differently. The negative shapes around them are different from each other. You notice the little holes, like inside the eye sockets, not inside, but near the eye sockets, the little holes of the skull are different. The shading on each side of the skull is different. So this really elegant way of treating shape, again, this idea that it looks kind of simple, but it's actually not as simple as you might expect. And that was her work, a kind of quiet elegance that was deceptively complex and intelligent. And that is Georgia O'Keeffe. Now we're going to take a break here, or intermission. We're going to talk a little bit about the language of history, and that artists, many artists, because artists are thinkers, it's a discipline, and it's important to know the history of art as one makes art. You know, you can't make art in a vacuum. I mean, you can, but it's not a professional thing to do. It's an amateur way of looking at painting, as if you're somehow separate from everyone else. You're not. Paintings are in a continuum with art history, and if you're going to make some kind of contribution to the history of art, you need to know the history of art and react to it, just like scientists need to know the history of their discipline and musicians need to know the history of their discipline and so forth. So right now we're looking at a very famous painting which will come up later in my list, and this is Manet's Olympia. Now, I'm not going to talk about what this painting's about or why it's important right now, but suffice to say, here we see this woman who's on a bed with this attendant, and she's naked, and she is looking at the viewer. And this became a very important painting for many reasons, and artists therefore have reacted to this painting in any number of ways, of which I'm only going to show you two, but there could be 100 paintings or more that have related to this painting, are in dialogue with this painting through history. So the first one we're going to look at is by Hung Lu. And we see the similar kind of a thing where there's a woman on a bed with an attendant, but it's actually two women who may or may not be related. Maybe they're lovers, maybe they're sisters, maybe they're twins. And then the attendants are in the background, which is actually an impressed photograph of actual people, right? And so there's a definite dialogue between the last painting and this painting in terms of motif and in terms of the relationship between the viewer and the the model and the attendants, and how they relate to the viewer of the painting themselves, and of course the background and how that relates to the figures. So we can see that very directly. And then as we move forward a little bit, then we come to Kehinde Wiley. And again, Kehinde Wiley is going to come up later in this discussion of the top 100 paintings. And here we see another painting where this youthful black male figure is laid out on this bed with this, again, this decorative background, and he is looking at the viewer. And just like Manet in the past broke tradition and challenged the notions of what art was and what is acceptable in art, Kehinde Wiley is doing the same exact thing 100 years later, of challenging what is acceptable in art and how we view it and what viewers expect to see versus what they are being presented with. So that dialogue, there's a lot of that dialogue throughout history. And as you start to look at art through history, you might start to notice how these paintings relate to each other and how one artist influences another across time, and how artists in the present are in dialogue with artists from the past. So number 55, James Rosenquist F111, 10 feet by 86 feet. So we have basically an installation painting, a huge painting, 86 feet long. So here we are in the 50s, and we are reacting, these artists are reacting against abstract expressionism and abstraction and returning to imagery, but in a new way that is influenced by pop culture. So in the 50s, this is the beginning of pop culture. This is the birth of pop culture. This is the birth of media. This is the birth of imagery everywhere, magazines and newspapers, the birth of television, movies. And so that highly influenced art of the time and what's called pop art as relating to pop culture. James Rosenquist was originally a painter of billboards. So in the old days, back in the 50s, earlier than that, billboards were actually painted by hand. Now they're, paper that's mounted. And so he was used to working in very large imagery. And so what we see here is a juxtaposition of all kinds of imagery from culture at the time, right? We have the beauty parlor, we have the nuclear bomb, we have canned SpaghettiOs, we have automobiles and tires and fast food and dessert and high color, all jumbled together into an amalgamation of influence from pop culture and how things get trivialized. And so we see this juxtaposition of this little girl under the hairdryer, which just happens to look like the front end of a missile, juxtaposed with an F-111 jet and nuclear explosions and the SpaghettiOs, or the spaghetti, canned spaghetti, which kind of looks like guts, right? Like that whole jumble of the profane and the capitalistic all jumbled together in an overwhelming image of culture. And that is an excellent representation of pop art and what pop art was all about. And certainly Rosenquist did a great job with that kind of application of imagery. Now we are moving on to the Wilton Diptych by an unknown artist. It's from 1395. This is one of our oldest pieces. This is 15 inches by 20 inches total. That includes the whole frame and both pieces and everything. They're not even sure if this painting is from England or France. It's an artifact. But what it is thought is it was painted for King Richard II, I believe. And it's kind of it's a very egotistical painting. So on the front, there's two sides of this. It's a diptych, but it's a double diptych. There are paintings on both sides. And I actually love the other side visually. I love the other side. This side is interesting. I love the other side. We'll get to that. But in this image, we have King Richard being presented to Christ, the infant Christ and Mary, which of course wouldn't and didn't happen, with St. John the Baptist, and I'm unsure who the other two figures are. But it's sort of like he had this commissioned and painted to show his importance in the world, that he as King of England is being presented to Christ. It's kind of preposterous when you think about it. Now, of course, it's painted in this gorgeous, beautiful, highly stylized, super detailed, methodical way of painting that, of course, was the tradition at the time, where things are very small and painted very slowly and painted with small brushes, and all those decorations in the background. I mean, that background on the left is crazy, right? And all those patterns in the background on the right, and all those wings with all the feathers and all the blue, all those blue colors and blue robes and light and dark, and the patterns in the other robes and so forth. I mean, just that immaculate detail is really interesting, and again, not something that's easily replicated in today's world. But here's the back, and I just love this back, and I'm not even sure why. I've loved this ever since I was a young student, and I saw it in an art history book. There's something so endearing about it. So it has this very modern look. Now, it wasn't painted with any modern ideas at all, but it has this modern look because of the weatheredness, where paint has been worn off and scraped off and lost and blended and smudged, and some parts of it are missing, and some parts look abstract and some parts look finished, and then the line up above, like it's just sort of drawn in, but it's not really finished. I mean, those are very postmodern ideas, and it just happens to look like that, even though it's from the 12th century. It's just so interesting. And then the deer too, where the deer is all rendered and the grass is rendered, but then the sky is kind of faded out and the antlers are faded out. And how the colors, the red colors inside the imagery works with the red colors outside the frame, even though that's probably just because it's worn and faded and distressed. But it's just the most endearing, sweet little image that looks both ancient and modern at the same time. And that is why the Wilton Diptych is in this list. Painting number 53 in our list, Edward Manet, The Bar at the Falaise Bergère, 1882, 38 by 51 inches. Now, this is a much discussed painting. I suppose you might say it's controversial in some ways. Art critics and historians like to argue about its meaning. And I'm not really here to discuss all of that controversy and meaning and who the person is and all of that. What I am here to talk about is how much of a beautiful painter Manet was. His work was exquisite. His work was a huge step forward in how contemporary artists thought about painting. His brushstrokes are gorgeous and meticulous. His color is gorgeous, and the way he organized his information is meticulous and very thought out. And yes, he definitely was a political painter. He took on significant issues of the day in Paris in terms of wealth, in terms of sexuality, in terms of class. But I just want you to appreciate the beauty of this painting. To think about, the setup. So we're looking at this woman, and then behind the woman, the bartender, the barmaid, there is a mirror in which we see all of the things happening in this very well-known establishment. This was a very specific place in Paris at the time, but we're not really part of it. As the viewer, we're not really part of it. We're not in the mirror. Like, we're a witness that doesn't actually exist. It's been argued, we're the person in the right part of the painting who's reflected in the mirror. But I don't really think that. I think we're just a witness to what is happening. We are, in a sense, the artist. And just the gorgeous brushstrokes of every little thing. I mean, I could go on and on about every little thing, whether it's the chandelier, whether it's the flower in her clothes, whether it's the flower in front of her, whether it's one of these bottles down here, the glass, the reflections, the metallic foil, the reflections in the mirror, the people in the mirror, and just the simple, elegant brushstrokes that make up those faces. If you really zoom in and look at them, they're not actually modeled faces the way the barmaid's face is modeled. They're just kind of stroked in there, and we interpret it and fill it in. The only part of this painting that I don't quite get visually is the trapeze artist in the upper left-hand corner. That just looks so much an afterthought as to how it's painted, and I don't really understand it compared to the rest of this lush, gorgeous, beautiful, complex, elegant painting. I mean, the bowl where the oranges sit, which of course the oranges were supposedly a symbol for prostitution, whatever, that bowl is just so gorgeously painted. It's both opaque and transparent at the same time, and reflective. So he's painting transparent, opaque, and reflective all in the same object. Just amazing. The other really cool thing is the Bass bottles. Those bottles of beer are Bass, which is still brewed today in England, and they still have the same label. It looks just like it did in the late 19th century. It's quite amazing. Just a gorgeous, gorgeous painting in which you can both look at this lush painting and appreciate for painting, but also dive in and think about, who is this person? What is she doing? What is the man? Where are you as the viewer? What are you witnessing? What is happening? If you care to do that. Manet was an amazing painter and absolutely highly, highly influential painter of his time. And I could have picked any one of dozens of his paintings to be in the top 100. He was a true master. Edward Manet. Not Monet, but Manet. M-A-N-E-T. 52, Henri Matisse, The Piano Lesson, 1916, 96 by 83 inches. This is quite a large painting for this time in history. An 8-foot painting. And so we see a fairly minimal image of a boy at a piano with some of the typical Matisse motifs and way of working and thinking. And so this painting is based on a trapezius shape. So that green shape over here on the left that would be about 6 foot high in the painting, that fairly bright green shape, a trapezius. And he plays with that shape throughout the painting. You can see actually the negative space on the other side of that green shape. The gray-blue shape is also an upside-down trapezius. And then there's another triangular trapezius down below that. And then we have the trapezius shape on the piano, and I'm forgetting the name of that metronome, the metronome on the piano. And then even sort of part of the upright that's holding the music stand up, and then the shape of the boy's eye and the shape of his mother's feet. All that trapezius shape, just from tiny to huge, all throughout the painting, interlocking it together to create both unity and tension with one shape, variation of one shape. And we also see Matisse's use of color. We see that gray, blue, green, yellow, purple color. So think about that. That background color is such a complex color that it's a color that you don't even know what color it is. Is it green? Sort of, but not really. Is it blue? Sort of, but not really. Is it purple? A little bit, but not really. Even some red. Is it gray? A little, but not really. And so the interesting thing about a color like that it has all these other colors in it, but it's not really any of those colors, is that color actually then harmonizes with all those other colors. So because it has green in it, it harmonizes with the green next to it. Because it has that purple in it, it harmonizes with the pink. Because it has blue in it, it harmonizes with the blue. And because it has blue in it, it also harmonizes with the orange, because orange is complement to blue. And so complex, unclear colors like that can be very powerful, because they can create a great deal of harmony in your art. And you have to be very careful. That is not a muddy color. That is a complicated color. And it's really important to learn the difference between a complex color and a muddy color. A muddy color basically limits all the hues so that the hues can't really talk, and therefore it doesn't have a identity. Whereas a complex color contains many hues, but you can see those hues so that it does indeed have an identity, even though it's hard to say what that identity is. So that is Henri Matisse. Two of the things that he really worked with, shape and color, and part of that idea of modernism that was born from analytical cubism, which we looked at earlier with George Braque. Our last painting of this video, number 51, Roger van der Weyden. the bone altarpiece from 1443 to 1451, which is 8 years, 130 inches by 157 inches. So here we have another altarpiece, a Northern Renaissance altarpiece. And it's a fairly dark one. Usually in an altarpiece we see the Annunciation, we see the Crucifixion. This one we see the Last Judgment. So in the center here we have this angel with sort of demonish wings and a scale, and she's weighing these people as Christ or God. You know, it's hard to know sometimes who's who. Christ as God judges these people, and you can see if they're sent off to the right, they are descending into hell, and if they are sent off to the left, they are accessing heaven. And I have to say, because, you know, Jesus was a progressive and a leftist, unbeknownst to many people. But I digress. So here again, Roger van der Weyden, just the incredible amount of detail and attention and time and meticulousness. I mean, 8 years. Think about making a painting for 8 years. And this, of course, this is mostly oil on oak. Some parts later transferred to canvas. It also has an exterior. So the center, here the center 5 panels, the 2 wing panels on each side, those 4 panels, the 2 wing panels actually close. And then the 2 panels, wing panels on top close. And there's another image there when the altarpieces close, which many altarpieces were built like that. They were built to be seen both closed and open. And they were often kept closed until specific times when they would be opened. And I'll get to that in a second. Now, when it's closed, we see saints and the commissioners, right? We see the people who commissioned this painting. Now, this altarpiece was commissioned for a hospital by a very wealthy man. And it was meant to give comfort, but also warning to those who were dying in the hospital. And I'm not sure how much comfort it might have offered. I mean, certainly some of the colors are pleasing, I suppose, but it's a fairly, it's still a fairly intense image, but also gorgeously painted. And so we see again this idea that artists both, you know, that artists at the same time investigate that which is sacred and that which is profane, or that which is beautiful and that which is ugly, or that which is light and that which is dark, however you want to say it or think about it, all at the same time. It's certainly something I work at with my own work. You know, what is that balance between dark and beauty? If it's too much beauty, it gets cute, it gets limited, it gets pretty, it gets light. There's no depth. It becomes schlocky, kitschy. If it's too dark, it can overwhelm people. They don't want to deal with it. They don't want to look at it. It's something I've struggled with in my own work sometimes. My work gets kind of heavy and dark. So it's a fine balance. And it really does create that, you know, it's sort of like the eternal battle between good and evil inside your artwork, inside this artwork. So mostly mostly why this is here is just, again, the meticulousness of the craft across multiple images and multiple square footage of paint, right? Of like so many figures, so many faces, so much information, and yet to never take any time off, to never cop out, to make every part of it equal. I don't mean equally visually, but I mean equal attention as all other parts, right? Like the smallest little yellow sunlight is paid the same attention to as someone's face or clothing. And that is such a Van der Weyden thing, that every single thing is important and every single thing has to be rendered and presented beautifully. So that is our list of art for this video. So we'll be looking at 50 through 41. Thank you for watching. If you made it this far, I greatly appreciate it. Please consider liking and subscribing, and I will see you next time. Happy painting.